our final keynote session for this afternoon, which comes from Sue Trinidad and Ian Cunningham of Curtin University. Professor Sue Trinidad is Director of the National Centre for Student Equity in Higher Education, which is hosted at Curtin. Prior to becoming the Director, Professor Trinidad was Deputy Pro-Vice-Chancellor and Dean of Teaching and Learning in the Faculty of Humanities at Curtin. She's an established scholar and researcher in the area of higher education, and she currently leads a team of 10 NCS EHE researchers and various projects. Ian Cunningham's a research assistant for the NCS EHE with a master's degree majoring in professional writing and publishing and a Bachelor of Arts in majoring in Internet Communications. He's currently assisting the NCS EHE in conducting reviews of 2014 and 2015 funding round reports, gathering research relating to social mobility through higher education, and cataloguing past and present research to a referencing database. All very useful and quite dense information. I think you're going to find this a particularly fascinating presentation from your own particular areas. They're going to speak to us today about emerging challenges for students with disability participating in higher education, a review of 6 NCS EHE funded research reports. Welcome, Ian and Sue.
Great, and on to the next one. Okay, thank you very much everyone for the invitation to come here and to talk to you about the review of the National Centre's funded research reports. And we're specifically looking at those that are in the area of students with disabilities. So on your table you will find those 6 reports that have been collated. Now, we didn't expect quite so many people still here at the end of the day, but this is all online, and I'm sure that there'll be a few copies left on some of the tables because some people may or may not take those. But that is the publication so that you have it all there in a hard copy. So we've had a wonderful day here at Pathways. We're just here for today and then we're off to Melbourne tomorrow because there's an awful lot of conferences on at the moment. But before I go any further, and I'm really looking forward to that cake, I want to thank our wonderful ladies here because haven't they been doing a wonderful job? I'm just looking at how exhausting it is and they're doing it in shifts. So I just wanted to thank them. What a wonderful, wonderful job. And it is always a pleasure to be at these conferences because we were at the Perth one for those people who came 2 years ago, and by golly, the years go by very quickly. So what we've been able to do through the National Centre is look at some of the aspects of student equity in higher education in Australia. And this, we're trying to contribute to the shaping of future directions. So we want to share with you some of the research that informs the policy and the practice. And through this meta-analysis, where we've been able to bring 6 critical reports together, this will provide greater clarity on the trends and issues that will drive equity in higher education today. And we all understand the important role of higher education, but I do know that there's a lot of people here from TAFE as well, which is very interesting. I've been talking to a number of colleagues today talking about how that pathway is being developed here, particularly in New South Wales, which is also very important. So our research is specifically looking at universities and university students, and being able to provide the opportunity and access and support for those students as they're going through higher education. And I want to thank, there's a number of researchers who have participated to the work that you'll see collated here, speaking today or at the conference today and speaking tomorrow. So I thank those people, and Ian will talk through those people in a moment, specifically naming them. I also wanted to thank the Attend group and Darlene, because what a wonderful collaboration we have shared over the last 2 years. We've been a part of the webinars, which has just been an absolute pleasure, coming online with a large number of people and being able to present some of this research and also to support the researchers who are doing that. So it's been a wonderful collaboration, and thank you to attend. Just a quick little bit of information about the National Centre. So our purpose, as we're funded by the federal government, as David Finton said this morning, is specifically looking at trying to close that loop between equity policy, research and practice. And so we have been hosted at Curtin for the last 3 years, and we've produced a lot of work in the space, and all of this work is accessible through our website. So it is, we call it NESHI, or you can actually sound it out, neshi.edu.au. So you're welcome to go and have a look at some of the work there if you've not already looked at our website. We also have an e-news, and this is collated around about every fortnight. Some of the things on there, of course, has been promoting this conference and the many wonderful conferences that we have across Australia, but also national and international research, helping people look at some of the great stuff that's happening at the moment. We also have our tweets, and that is Louisa in the blue there next door to Darlene, and you'll be very pleased to know that one very important tweet went out this morning, and it was picked up by Qantas. And Qantas is now going to look at improving its captioning of movies. So go social media, and well done, Louisa. That's the power of social media. We also have produced a number of publications, over 70 case studies of what's happening within our universities, and the partnerships in higher education one is particularly important, and these are all available. We can post them out to you if you want the hard copies, or alternatively to download from the website. But the partnerships in higher education talks about a lot of the wonderful community partnerships that are happening within our universities, and many of those partnerships are with the TAFEs and the other organisations within communities, and it's just so heartening to look at those 70 case studies and to really feel honoured that we're working with such a wonderful group of people who all work together for a common cause. We've also funded 24 research projects to date, and we have another 10 that are funded this year, and this is where some of that research has come from. So we've got those publications, and what is so important about those, and what the department is very appreciative of, and saying that the money is being well spent at the moment, is it's written in layman's speak, so that politicians and community people and everyone can understand the research. So we are really trying to translate that research into practice and policy. And of course, if you come into our website, there's lots of information there within the disabilities area as well as other areas. So what we have done is collated the 24 research projects, and this has been Ian's job, under each of the categories that we've been looking at. So we've funded one in scholarships, collated or did the meta-analysis. There's been one in Indigenous, issues within graduate outcomes, and low SES and first in family. And the one that we're going to talk to today is the issues and trends for students with disabilities. So there's been a lot of work done, particularly over the last 2 years in the research area, and we're leaving you with that publication, or you can come to our website. So I'm now going to hand over to Ian to talk through some of the work that he's produced.
Okay, great, thanks Sue. My name is Ian Cunningham. I'm a research assistant at the National Centre. It's a bit nerve-wracking following all the inspirational keynotes we've had so far today. And as my title might suggest, I might be a little bit dry by comparison, but I promise I have an anecdote somewhere in here to lighten things up a little bit. As Sue just mentioned, the Centre's been developing a series of reviews based on the research projects completed under the Student Equity in Higher Education Research Grants Program. This presentation will detail the review conducted on the research projects through the 2014 and 2015 funding rounds, which focused on students with disability. Through the course of conducting the review, we identified a number of points detailing emerging challenges for students with disability in higher education. I'll be looking at each project we reviewed, then outlining a few of the common findings which were present throughout many of the reports. Following this, we developed a series of recommendations based on the areas covered in these reports in order to communicate critical areas of policy and future research directions which can be taken in this field.
And I'm just going to add there that we have to acknowledge Matt Brett and also Trevor Allen's work, because they were able to peer review this work to make sure that the meta-analysis was done correctly.
Okay, so the first report we looked at was Exploring the Retention and Success of Students with Disability from Sue Kilpatrick, Susan Johns, Robin Barnes, Darlene McLennan, Sarah Fisher, Kerry Magnuson at the University of Tasmania. The report set out to explore the relationship between disability support policies at various institutions and the retention and success rates evident at these universities that they studied. To begin with, they took a broad look at student figures from the higher education student data collection reports to note the retention rates and success rates for students with disability at various institutions by location and university grouping. Semi-structured interviews were then conducted at 12 universities with varied overall performance of students with disability, 3 each with high performance, medium, inconsistent and low performance. To gauge the extent to which each took similar or differing approaches to disability support provision through their policies. To supplement these sources, an audit of university disability service websites was undertaken to provide further detail on the policies and institutional culture concerning disability support services. What they found was that student numbers vary widely, but there are a few common elements in the student share disparities. Smaller universities, typically those in regional areas and with between 10 to 20,000 students in total, had larger percentages of students with disability. Although the share of students with disability as a part of the whole student cohort exhibited clear differences, the share of each broad disability classification remained relatively stable across the data collection period. More stability was also seen when assessing the retention and success rates of students with disability across the time period indicated, with rates remaining constant yet lower than the total student population rates. With these figures though, university groupings showed significant variation in retention rates, with GO8 and ATN institutions displaying significantly lower rates than the other groupings. As for findings on support offerings and information on service accessibility, the research found options and attitudes were varied again across institutions. The website audit found detailed information on disability services was often lacking, in some cases due to websites being cumbersome to navigate. Interviews identified disability action plans didn't always have the support of staff, often due to a simple lack of awareness or policy attention. Many interviewees either saw DAPs, disability action plans, as insignificant or, and this was a quote, not playing a significant role in the way the university has developed its processes. Additionally, this lack of awareness could be due to a lack of staff training, which was also identified in most of the interviews as a point of further action, especially for casual academic staff, and I thought this was quite interesting, where only one university had any disability awareness training made mandatory for casual staff. It was not all bad news, however, as along with the willingness to facilitate better training for staff among institutions, Many indicated a conceptual shift away from a medical model of disability towards an inclusivity model of disability support by placing disability support under student support divisions rather than under health services. So the second report that we included in the review was Best Practice in Supporting Indigenous Students with Disability in Higher Education by Michelle Fleming, who you'll hear from tomorrow in another keynote, and Diana Grace at the University of Canberra. Their project drew from three core methods: an extensive literature review examining general disability services in higher education, disability support specifically for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and then disability support available to Indigenous students with disability at Australian universities. The Department of Education and Training data detailed enrolment figures for Indigenous students with disability, and then a survey was designed to gauge levels of support and coordination among disability units and Indigenous education units at universities. The report acknowledged up front that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have been over-researched and under-consulted. And later they speculate that this may be why only 2 survey responses from IEUs, the Indigenous Education Units, nationwide were received. Though the literature review, through the literature review, it was found that students with disability are more likely to rely on informal or external supports than they are to access and utilise university services. It's also suggested that this is especially the case for Indigenous students with disability who may not see the services at the universities as responsive to their issues and experience. As with many of the students with disability, Indigenous students with disability often find themselves in the precarious position of having to demonstrate their capability to study while also having to prove limitation in order to access necessary supports, and that such disadvantages are amplified by experiencing multiple equity identity status. As for the enrolment data consulted, the research found along with growth in the proportion of Indigenous students at university, Indigenous students in general, Indigenous students with disability are a growing share of that Indigenous cohort, making support for these students definitely a key priority. As previously mentioned, the survey results from IEUs was lacking, and so they weren't able to include it in the report. However, the results from disability units themselves were plenty, as 17 institutions nationwide responded, with 1 from each state and various university groupings, and also a mix of urban and regional institutions, so plenty of room for comparison there. They found less than half of the disability units surveyed collected specific information on Indigenous status upon registration. This directly impacts the next key finding, that additional support for Indigenous students was uncommon, and often in the form of referral to the university's IEU. Though with not all collecting information on Indigenous status coming in, the extent to which they're able to do that was potentially diminished. Despite this, coordination with IEUs was reportedly common, but not in the frequency of coordination between the two, with only complex cases generally having a coordinated approach between disability units and IEUs. The next report we consulted was supporting students with Autism Spectrum Disorder in higher education from Sieudwin Owen, Darmat McCann, Christopher Rayner, Carol Devereaux, Fiona Sheehan, and Lindsay Quamby at University of Tasmania again. This project set out to review the published literature, both domestic and international, on ASD in higher education and how these students interact with the built environment as well. This was followed by a cross-sectional analysis of the supports available at universities via surveys with practitioners, and supplemented with in-depth analysis of student experience through an interesting visual-based research, which I'll come to in a moment. First, the literature and practitioner surveys raised a number of points of interest. There's a need for more comprehensive integrated supports for students with ASD, as peer mentor and transition supports are proving successful, but they could benefit from integration with non-academic skill developments programs. More awareness is also needed among staff and fellow students, particularly for students with ASD, on the complexity of those on the spectrum and the perceptions of capability, because the perceptions of capability and disability are generally far narrower than the reality of student experience. Also, there's more room for emphasis on supports which promote students with ASD exercising agency through facilitating self-management where appropriate, because as we've heard earlier today, there's a fine line between providing support and restricting someone's capability. As mentioned before, the research undertook a visual-based analysis of the built environment, and the findings were quite unique and informative, actually, as the impact of the built environment is often underestimated for students with ASD on campus. The tension between forced interaction and social isolation was notable, as centralised university resources and services could provide sensory overload, but then the risk of social isolation associated with having quiet zones or safe spaces far away from the centre of campus could be just as concerning, really. In a similar way, teaching methods which make use of learning spaces in dynamic and collaborative ways could be highly effective for some students, but can be overstimulating for those with ASD, again providing another barrier to their learning. Navigation of campuses was also highlighted as a potentially overlooked issue, with the legibility of signs and the logical flow of campus and learning environments, which could cause excessive confusion for those who might be strictly logical thinkers. And here's the anecdote. As an example of this, when I was an undergraduate humanities student, I had a little bit of confusion as to where my classes were. I mean, engineering students might have all their classes in the engineering building, and the business students would all be in the CBS, but I counted I had classes in architecture building, commerce, health sciences, engineering, and the education buildings, so I can definitely understand how it would be difficult to figure it out. The next report we looked at was the role of inherent requirement statements in Australian universities by Matt Brett, who's also here today, Andrew Harvey, Andrew Funston, Rachel Spicer and Adam Wood at La Trobe University. Their project set out to outline the broad legislative, demographic and policy contexts for IRSs through an analysis of Australian and international, which they drew predominantly on literature from the US, and policies. To supplement their investigation, they conducted a select audit of the current IRS policies that are in place at Australian universities. Given the relatively under-researched nature of IRS, the importance of more information was highlighted often in the report. It was also noted that the lack of literature to provide guidance on the rationale for and application of reasonable adjustments was also an issue for understanding the implications of having IRS in place. Often the concern with reasonable adjustments were to do with academic standards and requirements. However, the disability standards for education were noted as providing guidance on how and when adjustments may or may not be seen as reasonable. However, it's important to note that IRSs were not only formed for students with disability in mind, as there are also a variety of groups which benefit from explicit details on what's required for successful participation in a university course. As to the specific issues for IRS in place already, consistency was a major concern. The approach to developing and communicating IRS to prospective students, there's a need for that to be standardised to reduce confusion for applicants and ensure that universities are able to clearly articulate what's required of those who might be looking to undertake a course of study. And the researchers identified this could be assisted by developing evidence-based guidelines and or frameworks for universities to base their IRS on. Also to allay concerns regarding exclusionary language and reference to or impressions of exclusionary practices when articulating the IRS. The next study was the only one included from the 2014 round because when we were looking at the research projects to approve for the 2015 round, identified that there was quite a lack of research in the students with disability area, so we decided to make quite a focus. So all the rest of the 5 reports that we looked at were from the 2015 round. There were a few others that had a little bit of focus on students with disability as well. So this study, titled Resilience Thriving in Post-Secondary Students with Disabilities, from Rahul Ganguly, Charlotte Brownlow, Jan Dupries and Coraline Graham at the University of Southern Queensland. Their study consisted mainly of 2 interview phases. First, an online survey conducted at a regional university to ascertain student demographics, experience and performance. Following this, they had an in-depth interviews with purposefully selected thriving students. One of the core findings of this study was that students with a GPA of greater than 5.5 exhibited higher levels of resilience and academic satisfaction. Also, they found that those who indicated academic success were more likely to be strategic and self-motivated learners, seeking out appropriate service where needed and relying on their own capabilities where possible. However, despite these 2 findings, there wasn't a direct link that could be drawn between resilience and specific indicators of academic achievement. Beside resilience, there were other interesting findings on how students with disability who were thriving approached their studies and how they perceived barriers to success. Those who were interviewed indicated they were more likely to attribute barriers to external factors rather than individual characteristics, which could subsequently indicate greater resilience through not laying blame for disadvantage on themselves. Most alarmingly, however, despite the students being interviewed indicating relative success so far, there were cases identified where teaching staff had refused the allowance of reasonable adjustments due to their own perceptions of a reduction in academic integrity or providing an unfair advantage to these students. This clearly adds further emphasis to earlier points about the need for more disability awareness training so that staff are more than aware of the need for these services. Overall, the authors found students could display success when their disabilities were less present in the course of their education. As such, they suggest support be provided with the notion of first enable the environment and then enable the student. The final report we included in the review was the only one to focus solely on students with disability in online higher education. Access and Barriers to Online Education for People with Disabilities by Mike Kent at Curtin University took a detailed look at students with disability studying through Open Universities Australia. The research took a detailed look at the accessibility of online learning for students with disability and their approach to disclosure through 356 responses to a survey distributed amongst OUA students. These surveys included an invitation to volunteer for follow-up interviews, which attracted more than 60% of respondents to volunteer, which were 226 students in total, with 143 ending up being able to take part in the interviews later on to form this report. So there's plenty of evidence to go on with this one. The study found students with disability viewed online study as a preferred mean of accessing higher education. This may seem pretty obvious because they're all online students, but some of them indicated that they found the mainstream university system was just purely inaccessible to them. So that's basically why they said that online university was a preferred means. The categories indicated by survey respondents detailed some unexpectedly high incidences of students with mental illness at 44.9% and medical impairments at 39.2%. He noted that this is largely due to actual numbers of students with mental illness being hidden behind the official data collection classification. The one which captures them is classed as other. So there's a huge problem there, but I'll return to that point later. There were comparatively low proportion of responses from those with hearing and vision impairments, as well as learning and intellectual disabilities. However, these students responded at a greater rate than their representation in OUA figures detail. These response figures, combined with the official OUA figures for students with disability, indicated a need to reassess the way in which universities approach disability support and teaching practices for students with disability online. A few issues specifically related to OUA's model of online higher education were also identified. Many students interviewed indicated that administrative procedures and restrictions around disclosure of disability status were unnecessarily prohibitive and onerous, due to the fact that students had to go through the disclosure process every single time they took a unit at a different institution. Many raised that they would have preferred the option to just allow the disability services of OUA to automatically disclose for them to the next institution that they start studying at. As had been raised in many of the reports in this review, universal design principles appeared to be lacking in online higher education, even through OUA, with many courses simply attempting to mirror on-campus delivery rather than taking advantage of the opportunities that are available through an online delivery of education. Additionally, the interview responses noted OUA's continuous study cycle, where 1 out of 4 terms begins the very week the previous one finishes, can present greater inflexibility for those with intermittent yet severe conditions which might interrupt their studies at certain points. Okay, sorry, before we move on to the recommendations, which we drew from this, we've just got a few groupings of common findings which came from all 6 of the reports. First, in terms of the cohort details, it's clear that official disability classifications really do need revision in the interest of more accurate data collection, but also in the interest of being able to actually identify what some of the issues that are captured, especially under the category of other, they actually are, because they can vary a lot. Just to name a few that fell under other were students who experienced mental illness, intellectual disability, or acquired brain injury. And so, as you would all know, each of those classifications would carry quite different needs. Another crucial finding is that the overall percentage of enrolled students with disability is rising, but with smaller universities showing greater gains. Unfortunately, though more students with disability had the opportunity to study at university, their labour market outcomes are still poor in relation to the overall student cohort. As for the support and experience of students with disability, a critical finding was that students who seek support tend to exhibit greater retention and success rates, which is an important factor to keep in mind when considering how important it is that students are aware of the existence of support services to begin with. And when considering measures to address stigma in particular, especially for students with mental illnesses, to ensure that disclosure is encouraged. Which leads to the next point, that disability awareness training is seriously needed in some cases and should be implemented at all levels of university structures. And this includes not just the academic staff, but administrative staff as well. Finally, universal design principles need to be revisited and applied across all courses, especially those courses taught online. How are we going? Okay, so now to the recommendations that we gathered from reviewing the details contained in these reports, and also some of the specific recommendations that were advised by the researchers themselves. The first one we came to was that disability-related data collection and performance indicators should be refined to gain a better understanding of the participation of students with disability in higher education. As I mentioned previously, large groups of students with disability can tend to fall under the other category. However, simply adding more classifications for students to self-identify within might not adequately address the inherent flaws of such data collection to begin with. Although the issue of self-identification accuracy is a complex issue to address, bringing classifications in line with those used in other comprehensive data sets, such as the Survey of Disability and Carers Census, might assist in ensuring that sufficient level of detail and accuracy in reporting is maintained over a period of time. The second recommendation is that universities must ensure inherent requirement statements are clear, transparent, and in accordance with the Higher Education Standards Framework, Disability Discrimination Act, and Disability Standards for Education. IRSs have a need to be clearly described and revised to ensure that they're serving the purpose of signalling necessary capabilities rather than acting as barriers to participation. The third recommendation we came with was that pedagogical methods, materials and technology should, where possible, always adhere to the principles of universal design, and further efforts need to be made to provide a variety of options for engaging with learning content and spaces. The fourth recommendation would be that disability awareness training be made a mandatory component of induction materials and institutional policy training for all administrative and academic staff, and again for casual staff as well. The fifth recommendation that we developed was that the option for increased agency be provided to students as to the management of information and disclosure regarding their disability. As found in the IUA study, the requirement for students to disclose their disability to multiple institutions is a significant point of concern for some students, and the need to self-disclose could risk inflaming concerns of stigmatisation over and over again every time they have to disclose. Recommendation 6 deals with the coordination of support services, suggesting universities develop more holistic approach to support for students with disability, providing study and organisational skills in conjunction with learning access plans and in consultation with faculties and other educational support units, such as Indigenous education units for Indigenous students with disability. So I'm trying to get through this a little bit quicker. And for the final recommendation, we identified there's a need for support services and study terms to offer more flexible options for students with disability. As I just mentioned before, some of the reports noted that disability and health services or supports are often only available on campus during office hours on weekdays, and as such this could be difficult for students who have multiple things that they have to get to through the day, such as work and study, which might be during those hours that the supports are available. Also, it was mentioned the IUA's 13-week continuous study periods. They could be impediments to success for those who experience intermittent disruptions, or those who need the breaks to actually consolidate what they've learnt after a period of study. But for on-campus education, they could also provide an opportunity for those who need to be continually engaged and don't actually do so well with having such a large break. And just finally, we had a few points of further research, some areas that were identified for further research. For achievement and retention, Kilpatrick and Ganguly's reports noted research is needed to better understand aspects of student achievement and retention. The next one was that it was strongly recommended that research be done to ascertain the optimal taxonomy for data collection and disability classifications for students with disability. The next one, Owen noted that particularly in regards to students with ASD, the evidence base and a greater understanding of the most effective supports could be strengthened with further research into these students, while Brett and his fellow researchers identified that further research could go a long way to informing analysis and development of inherent requirement statements for universities. It was also identified employment outcomes are recently beginning to attract more research attention, but relatively little is known about the disadvantages associated with disability and how they contribute to inequitable graduate outcomes for students with disability. And finally, Kilpatrick et al. And Kent noted that the recruitment and outreach directed towards students with disability might be lacking in widening participation initiatives, especially given that they're one of the most significantly underrepresented equity groups in Australian universities. And so that's finally all that we have. If you would like more detail, the reports are in front of you or they're available on our website, as well as the links through to the full reports that we conducted this review on, which contain far more detail.
40 minutes.
Ian and Sue, thank you. That was actually, I thought, a really fascinating and detailed lot of analysis. I'm wondering if there are people in the room who've got questions. We've probably got time for a couple. If you would like to put your hand up and we'll get a microphone to you. Yeah, we've got a question down here.
Hi. I apologise if you mentioned this at the beginning and I missed it, but how will this report be distributed to universities? Because there are a number of those recommendations that I'm sure a number of us would love to see implemented, but really, unless the powers that be, A, know about it, and B, have the will to change it, it's not going to make any difference.
So as David Fenton from the Education Department of Education and Training, the federal government department, mentioned this morning, there's a number of reviews, and we do know that there'll be some funding and consideration through those reviews, but we're waiting for the results for next year. So yes, I can imagine that there's going to be some opportunities for universities to look more closely at what's happening with the disability group.
Do we have some other questions? Oh yes, lots. I thought so. We'll go to you first and then come to you.
It's Matt Brett from Latrobe. Thanks for that. I think it's a really good report. You've been doing some great stuff at the National Centre. David Fenton this morning sort of made the point that students with disabilities are often the poor cousins of other equity groups, and I think just kind of put it over to you from the National Centre's perspective. Do you see that's a valid conclusion? And if so, what can be done to elevate the status of disability within equity and within higher education?
Answer that one, Ian?
Yeah, I think as I mentioned, for the 2015 funding round, we also came to that conclusion, which was why we made sure that we had a specific focus on approving some grants for, that were looking at students with disability, because we saw that there was a lack of research in this space. I guess going forward, the best thing we can do is continue, like we've got a few recommendations for further research there. We can also use our capacity to also make sure that we look into that research and ensure that we're able to collect it and disseminate it as well, so that it stays front of mind.
Okay, and we'll go to you, just here.
I think in the research, some of it recommended a flexibility to learning was encouraged, but also there was a contrast of inherent requirements as needing to be outlined, which I think sometimes would I guess, essentially contrast each other. I was wondering if there are any recommendations or solutions for almost a juxtaposition in that, or in the reports or in your own findings.
Yeah, I think it was interesting because we held a forum on Monday, and at the forum I found out that only 50% of universities currently use inherent requirement statements, and there are quite a few universities who have specifically mentioned that they don't actually want to have inherent requirement statements, because a better approach would be to make sure that they have an inclusive environment at the forset, so they don't have to actually indicate to students that there are inherent requirements they need to study. So I guess, I mean, personally, I think that would be a good approach, to try and approach it that way. But yeah, in terms of the study periods and how that would interact with inherent requirement statements, I suppose, I guess I don't really have a good answer for that. It's a good question, it's something to look into. You might want to speak to Matt Brett himself, who was part of the report on inherent requirement statements. But yeah, also the link for the full report, it will be on our website available as well.
I just would make the comment that as an outside observer, you mentioned any number of times the idea of universal design principles being missing. I find that staggering because that goes to almost everything you discussed, doesn't it? It goes to the lack of comprehensive information about students. It touches on the funding principles that we've heard about earlier this morning. It just seems like right through the reviews, the common factor is that there is a lacking standard or comprehensive framework.
Well, yeah, because I think when you think about universal design, there's some initiatives that are just standard now, like having captioning services, like having online lectures provided as videos and as audio files online for students. But then there's also other aspects which aren't really taken into account. Like I can remember nearly every single unit I ever studied had group work components as mandatory, and so they can present certain barriers for people with specific disability types, and the fact that that's mandatory in every single unit and there's no way of getting around it, and they can often be quite a large percentage of your overall mark, is I think some of the areas of universal design which aren't really as well paid attention to. Yeah.
Well, and it just leads me to wonder, when you've also talked a lot about when people have questions about disclosure, that if there aren't universal principles, then absolutely people will be thinking, why would I bother disclosing if I don't know whether this institution is going to do anything about it, or I'm just labelling myself? Yeah. Do we have? Sorry, did you want to? Do we have any other questions in the room? Okay, look, let's thank Ian and Sue for a very concise and useful presentation. Thank you.